Great. Well, thank you for that welcome. And a special thank you to all of those who've organised EA Global in all of its locations, and including this one, of course. It's great to get a chance to talk about this topic in a conference in what I still think of as my hometown, even if I'm not here all year. So I was a bit unsure, though, what to do in this particular session, because I don't know how well all of you already know everything that there is to know about effective altruism. And some of this will be very familiar to some of you. I'll probably skip through quicker than I would with an audience that I expected to be less well informed, and perhaps pause on some of the other questions a little bit. But so apologies if there's already things that you know about too much. But that's just the title. We can skip that. You might have already seen the Wikipedia page on effective altruism. I think that this is actually quite a good short account of what effective altruism really is, that's worth using when talking to people who don't know anything about it. Note that it's described as both a philosophy and a social movement. Philosophy here is in the broad popular sense, I guess. It's not a particularly, clearly specified philosophical doctrine. In fact, a number of different ethical approaches that can agree on supporting effective altruism. But it's a philosophy in the idea of sort of, what are you going to do with your life sort of philosophy. And it's a social movement. I'm sure many of you consider yourselves part of that movement, and it is now becoming a worldwide movement with people promoting it, developing it, living in accordance with it, joining organisations that are associated with it. So that's an important thing, and I'm sure you already have been talking just today about applying evidence and reason to determine the most effective ways of improving the world. But when we talk about improving the world, as you just heard in Hilary Greaves' talk a moment ago, there's a whole lot of questions that could be raised. What counts as improving the world? I'm going to take as an approximation something that Holden Karnofsky put online a couple of years back. Holden, many of you will know, is co-founder of GiveWell. And this was a blog in which he just talked about what a characteristic EA values. I've slightly modified the wording, but it's basically his. So universal perspective is important. EA is about doing good for the world, not just for your particular community or some part of it. EAs, I think, all agree that well-being matters. So suffering and premature death are bad things. Premature death, we've just had a little bit of a discussion as to why that's a bad thing. But even if we just focus on the loss to the parents, for instance, that would be one reason for thinking that premature death is a bad thing. Plus, premature death from illnesses like malaria are not themselves free of suffering. So even if you just talked about those things, that would matter. But of course, for many people, the loss of the future life of the child may also be a bad thing. I hope we'll be talking more about that. Generally speaking, effective altruists agree that animal suffering counts. I haven't come across anybody in the movement who thinks that it doesn't count. But whereas I and a number of other people in the movement have seen that for many years as a really important cause to work for, that reducing the suffering of animals is a major area in which effective altruists should work, others don't think that. Now, that isn't because they don't think animal suffering matters. I've put in this how much, or I think Holden already had something like that in. Perhaps it's not so much the ethical question of does suffering matter less because it occurs to a non-human animal, but rather how much do non-human animals really suffer? Are they capable of suffering that is similar to ours, as deep or intense as ours, whatever kinds of terms you want to use? And if you think that they're not, then that would be a reason for not giving it that much weight. And I'm going to be talking more about that in my further talk this afternoon, so I won't go into that more now. Then there's a question about whether other principles have intrinsic weight, like justice, equality, and fairness, and whether moral rules matter in themselves, or only insofar as they lead to better consequences. And in fact, it's interesting that Holden's view was that the characteristic EA view is essentially that they don't matter in themselves. They matter only because they lead to greater well-being. So that's a pretty explicitly then consequentialist, even utilitarian view. When I talk to general audiences where only a small portion of them are likely to be already utilitarians or consequentialists, I go out of my way to emphasize that you don't have to be a consequentialist to be an effective altruist. I don't think we want this movement to be simply something that appeals to people who are already consequentialists. There's too many people out there who think that justice and equality and fairness matter in themselves, or who think that there are some moral rules like you should never kill an innocent human being that we ought not to violate. And since obviously such people can do a lot to improve the world and can be effective altruists in pretty much all of the real-world situations that they're likely to find themselves in, because they're not really going to have to go around killing innocent people in order to improve the world. So, we want to bring them into the fold. We don't want to make them feel that they're excluded because this is a movement of consequentialists. And also, the other thing is the emphasis on expected value. Obviously, we have to take into account the odds on whether we will achieve our goals, so that big goals with low probabilities still count, and maybe even outweigh smaller goals with high probabilities of success. And that's another important thing to think about when we get into discussions with people who are saying things like, well, why are you just giving out nets against malaria, to take the example that Hillary just used? Why aren't you trying to fight climate change? Or why aren't you trying to change the economic order so that it's more fair for poorer countries? So I think they can become effective altruist causes if we're talking about expected value, even if the chances of achieving those things are small. Okay, for those of you who are interested in philosophical background to this, there's a lot of ways in which you can get to the sort of values that were up on that previous slide. My favourite is through Henry Sedgwick. Philosophers will all know who Sedgwick is. Others may not, but you will have heard probably of Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill. If we talk about the great trinity of 19th century utilitarians, then you add the name of Henry Sedgwick to Bentham and Mill. He was the last of them. He was he's certainly the least well known. That's because he's more of an academic philosopher than the other two. And his great work, The Methods of Ethics, that I'm quoting from here, is certainly not read by people who are not philosophers, and not even read very widely by philosophers, because it is a rather dense work, and his prose style, you have to admit, is not up to John Stuart Mill's, but he is a much better philosopher than John Stuart Mill. I'm happy to defend that if anybody wants to get into arguments later on. So here's a quote that I think makes the sort of point that effective altruists want to make, that we try to look at things from the point of view of the universe. And note the parenthetical, if I may say so. Sedgwick isn't saying that the universe has a point of view, but he's saying we can detach ourselves by our own particular stance in terms of where we are, who we're connected with, and we can imagine that we're taking this point of view. And from that point of view, the well-being of any one of the person there, of any one individual, is of no greater good, or is no more important than the good of any other. And then this gives you just a little sample of why Sedgwick's sentences get long and why he's a good philosopher, because he then qualifies it immediately by saying, unless that is, there's special grounds for believing that more good is likely to be realised in the one case than in the other. So when he says one individual and you say, well, what about that individual over there who's in a persistent vegetative state and can't experience pleasure or pain at all or anything else, then of course Sedgwick will say, well, there's more good to be realised in the case of somebody who's not in a persistent vegetative state than somebody who is, because the other person can have all of these positive experiences that are good, and then in between those extreme cases there may be other cases as well. So that's why the qualification is there. But the general idea is anybody's suffering counts equally, anybody's happiness counts equally from that point of view of the universe, and that's the point of view that as effective altruists we want to take. Okay, so that's the philosophy. I just think it's good for people to have some faces of some of the key people, perhaps have been talked about already a little today, certainly the organisations that I've founded. But as we're here in Melbourne, let's start with another Melbourne person, Toby Odd, also grew up here and began his studies in philosophy and math at the University of Melbourne, just up the road, but then went to Oxford to do graduate work, and I think it's pretty well known now, decided one day that he wanted to calculate how much good he could do if for the rest of his life he continued to live on something approximating his graduate studentship while giving away all of everything that he earned above that. And you know, he calculated what sort of earnings he would have if he were to follow a normal academic career, how much spare money that would give him to give away, and then looked at cost-effective interventions, came up with the idea of preventing blindness or restoring sight in people who are blind in developing countries, and ended up with a figure of 80,000 people who he alone could prevent becoming blind through trachoma prevention programs, or perhaps restore sight through cataract removal programs. And he was very impressed that one person on relatively modest income could make such a huge difference to the world, and he thought people ought to know about that, and founded Giving What We Can, and took a pledge to live on something just a little bit above his graduate studentship, which he thought was an adequate amount to live on, and is currently doing that. And of course, the founding of Giving What We Can, I think, was an important moment in the development of an actual movement, an actual effective altruism movement, rather than just a number of people vaguely thinking, yeah, we should be doing more about global poverty and issues like that. Another person who helped Toby to do that is Will McCaskill, who also founded 80,000 Hours, which I think you've heard about a bit, or will, but I'll say a little bit about that. But I particularly want to say Will's got this book out, Doing Good Better, and while I do hope if you haven't read The Most Good You Can Do, you will, but I also strongly recommend that you get hold of Doing Good Better. So there's 80,000 Hours, if you're not already familiar with that website, which is helping people make career choices, and I know there's discussions and opportunities to discuss that. I think Jess is around somewhere in the audience you can have discussions with if she's not already booked out about career choices. So I think that's also been an important organisation in the movement, and one of the things that I find actually is a very useful talking point to challenge people with is to tell them about people who are earning to give, which is one of the novel ideas that comes out of 80,000 Hours. Most people assume that when you talk about ethical career choices, you're talking about becoming an aid worker or going to get a medical degree and going to work in a developing country. But one of my students at Princeton, Matt Wager, decided, really on the basis of discussions with people from 80,000 Hours or influenced by 80,000 Hours, that he ought to go to Wall Street, given that he could get a high-flying job there. And he's done this. The slide could be updated. He's now about 3 or 4 years out of graduation, but he's continued to donate six-figure sums to effective charities each year following that. And despite the things you hear about people saying, oh, well, you know, if you do that, you just turn yourselves into a means to an end. You're not living a rich, full life. You're not following your passion. People say all sorts of things like that. But I saw Matt in April. He's very happy with what he's doing. He's enjoying the work. He's currently been transferred by his company to Hong Kong, where he's enjoying the novelty of living in a very different sort of environment, and continuing to think that he's made a good choice. And there are many other people in that sort of situation as well. And here's somebody else, Julia Wise, who quite independently came to the idea that when she was spending money on things she didn't need for herself, she was effectively depriving somebody else who needed that money much more than she did. So she already decided while an undergraduate, as I say, without having, I mean, Will and Toby and Matt have all studied philosophy, but Julia was studying to be a social worker and hadn't really read anything but philosophers had written on this, but just sort of had this intuition that she knew there were poor people in the world. She knew there were agencies that would take her donations and help them, and she thought that she should do that. So even when she was earning less than $40,000 a year, and living in Boston, that's not a lot to live on, she was giving a third of her income. She persuaded her boyfriend, Jeff Kaufman, now her husband, to do the same sort of thing. Fortunately, Jeff, who was in computer programming, has now ended up with a job at Google in Boston, so he's earning significantly more than $40,000, and they've upped their giving to about half. The other reason why I like to talk to people who don't know much about effective altruism about Julia is that she has this blog, givinggladly.com, and for people who want to get a sense of somebody who's not really an academic philosopher, is not thinking about some of the abstract sorts of issues that we academic philosophers are prone to talk about, but is talking about the nitty-gritty of how do you live a life as an effective altruist, what is it you cut back on, how do you make those decisions, how do you make, for example, a decision whether or not to have a child. Her blog talks about that. And not only does it talk about it, it talks about it in a very positive way. And the fact that it's called Giving Gladly is not an accident. Julia and Jeff really enjoy what they're doing. They think their giving makes their lives much more worthwhile than whatever it might be that they would have spent, that extra money that they would have had, would have contributed to their lives. And I think that's a very good example to motivate people to think positively about effective altruism. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about this issue of cause prioritization that Hilary was also just talking about, but in a rather different way. But there are many good philosophical issues about that, and we just had one of them that I hope we'll discuss a lot more. But I want to emphasize why it's really important that we get people to focus on this, and that's why one of the things that people don't focus on. And that's partly because of the size of philanthropy around the world and the cost of it not being really well thought through. So I use, as an example, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, who are a huge philanthropy advising service based in the United States, but I think not limited to the United States, intended for people who are going to be giving reasonably significant amounts of money into philanthropy, and to advise them on how to do that. Now, we're talking about billions of dollars being directed by people who are advised by Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors and other philanthropy advisors. It's a very large amount of money. In the United States alone, the total that's given each year to philanthropy, I think the most recent figure, it touched $350 billion. So worldwide, it's going to be significantly more than that. And it has obviously potential to do very huge amounts of good. But with advisors like this, although they say sensible things like giving away money is simple, giving away money effectively is an entirely different matter, something we'd all agree with. When you actually get to giving away money effectively, I think the argument just collapses. They have this leaflet, Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy. They divide up the field of philanthropy like this. Now, what do you notice when you look at how the field of philanthropy is divided up like this? Sorry? Everything is equally weighted. That's good. Everything is equally weighted. Anything else? Any other suggestions? Yeah, what's missing? Tell me what's missing. Animal rights or even animal welfare is completely missing. Maybe wild animals, if you think they have positive welfare, come in preserving the environment, but the welfare of animals on factory farms or other places doesn't seem to fit at all. Anything else missing?
Who's the major beneficiary of economic security?
Sorry? Yeah, exactly. The global poor, right? Yeah. So exactly, there's no division into whether you donate within the United States or global poverty. I mean, all of these things, it could be economic security, could be health as well, could be education. You can do all of those domestically in the United States, or you can do them in developing countries. And it makes a huge difference. And then, as somebody said, equally weighted. Well, yes, we have arts and culture and heritage and so on, equally weighted with economic security or health. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that they don't really think there are objective answers to these questions anyway, of what causes are better than others. And although I acknowledge that some of these choices are very difficult, and again we might get into that, say, in terms of the discussion about animals later, is there an objective criterion for saying when you ought to put more money into improving animal welfare, human welfare, and some other issues? It's certainly not true all the time that there's no objective answers between different choices. So, but that's very common when you talk to people who are philanthropy advisors. This is not just a sort of random or selected example. It's very common that people say things like, well, you have to make up your own mind. What are you passionate about, and so on. They don't look at it. But even when you look at the examples they give, it seems to me that they pretty much contradict themselves. So here's a couple of examples in that Finding Your Focus in Philanthropy leaflet. Here's one that I think was clearly a very good donation. Ted Turner, who was the founder of CNN, way back in 1998 donated $1 billion to the United Nations to scale up health programs that stop killer diseases in children, things like immunising kids against measles, reducing malaria, preventing and treating diarrhea, those sorts of things. This line comes from, I think this line comes from the RPA leaflet. I didn't say that the cost per life was as low as $80. I'm sure it's not as low as $80 today anyway. Certainly GiveWell thinks that it's much higher than that, around $3,000. But maybe at the beginning it was as low as $80 because there was so much low-hanging fruit to be picked, so much that hadn't been done. Anyway, that donation, which started off something which was later added to by the Gates Foundation and others, has undoubtedly saved many millions of lives and helped to dramatically reduce infant mortality from what it was when that program began. Here's a different example, which again is sort of just given equal weight in the RPA leaflet, a gift to establish a children's hospital in Palo Alto. If you don't know where Palo Alto is, it's at the bottom end of Silicon Valley. It's where Stanford University is. It's the third most affluent community in the United States. So clearly, if you set up a hospital in Palo Alto, nobody in Palo Alto was unable to get to a hospital. And incidentally, despite some myths about health insurance in America, nobody is unable to obtain the services from a hospital. Even if you have no insurance at all, if in an emergency you turn up in a hospital's emergency room, they can't turn you away if your life would be in danger if they were to turn you away. So everybody is entitled to some hospital treatment, whatever their insurance status in the United States. So then what the hospitals do is they do things like this. They may spend between $1 and $2 million to separate a pair of conjoined twins flown in from Costa Rica. It's great that conjoined twins can be separated and can presumably have better lives than they would if they remained conjoined. But in terms of saving lives, even if you take the, not the $80 figure, but the $3,000 figure, clearly you could save a large number of lives. You could save thousands of lives, tens of thousands of lives for the cost of well, thousands anyway, I guess, say, for the cost of separating twins. So even on criteria that anyone ought to use, it's surprising that RPA don't see that there are objective answers to one of their examples being a better use of money than the other. And we had the arts and culture heritage, so I just wanted to mention this example, which occurred earlier this year. David Geffen is not a household name, but DreamWorks is probably something been familiar to all of you when you go to the movies and see the logo. So David Geffen is behind DreamWorks as well as a number of other entertainment ventures. He's a billionaire, and he recently responded to an appeal by the Lincoln Center, which is the sort of premier center in Manhattan for opera and classical music concerts, and they want to renovate their concert hall. They're actually appealing not for $100 million, but for $500 million, $500 million, to renovate the concert hall. And David Geffen gave the sort of initial foundation donation, for which he's also going to get the naming rights. It's currently called Avery Fisher Hall, and they had to negotiate with the Fisher family and pay them $15 million to give up the naming rights. So actually only $85 million of this is going to build the hall, which suggests that David Geffen values having his name on the hall at least $15 million. But, whatever you think about that, I find it very difficult to see that providing a better concert hall for people to hear opera or classical music is in any way comparable, again, to what you could have done with $100 million. Maybe you could have restored sight in 1 million people if we take that at $100 per procedure, which is not an unreasonable figure on some estimates. So I think, we can argue about how you compare the culture and the arts. I've tried in one piece that I've written to use risk of occurring things and the extent to which people are prepared to incur risks as a way of doing this. This is something that economists sometimes use. If you want to find out how much do people value their personal safety, for example, you ask them how much extra they would pay to fly on an airline which had a lower crash record, better safety than an alternative airline. People are not actually terribly good at estimating it, taking into account differences between like 1 in 1 million chance of dying and 1 in 100 million chance of dying. So it's not a fantastic foolproof way of doing it, but you can do something like this. You can say, okay, so for suppose that you can restore someone's sight for $100. Instead, you're paying $100 million for a renovated concert hall. Would you go to the hall if there was, let's say, a 1 in 1,000 chance that by going to the renovated concert hall you would become blind? So I think very few people would do that. They would say, no thanks, I would put up with the unrenovated concert hall. Well, you do then have to consider, I guess, how many people are going to benefit from the renovated concert hall. But I think with reasonable odds and reasonable numbers, you can still get an objective measure of the idea that it would have been better to use this money to prevent people becoming blind than renovate the concert hall. That's just one way of doing it. There's also there's another position that some moral philosophers hold, that essential basic goods, like for example sight or life, always trump inessential goods like improved aesthetic experiences. Strict consequentialists probably don't want to say that, but a lot of other philosophers do think that. So argued, for example, by Tim Scanlon in What Do We Owe Each Other, a well-known work of moral philosophy, that the pleasure of even a vast number of people cannot outweigh the severe pain of of one person. So I think there are good reasons, again, for saying that there are objective reasons for preferring things like helping the global poor over donating large sums to the arts. Okay. There's the blindness prevention program. How are we going for time?
So we've got about 7 minutes.
Okay, so I'll get close to winding it up. I want to comment on one objection that often comes up when you talk about why we should help the global poor rather than donate to the arts. People often say, well, why is it an either-or choice? Why can't we do both? And when Nicholas Kristof wrote about Matt Wager in the New York Times, and also referred to the most good you can do and to the kind of arguments that I've just been putting, sure enough, somebody commented online that we shouldn't play off one against the other. That's a false choice. They're both worthy of support. Well, my response to that is, I wish I had a bank account where I could give all of my spare cash to preventing human illness, and then I could also give all of my spare cash to the arts or some other activity, and it wouldn't in any way diminish what I had available to give to preventing human illness. But my bank won't let me write checks for everything in my account to 2 different causes. They bounce one of the checks when that happens. So I think it always is a choice. You always, yes, of course you can divide how much you're going to give between the arts and human illness, but then you're only doing half as much to prevent human illness. And if that's the more effective thing to do, that's what you should be doing with all of your donation, not just half of it. So I think you've probably talked a lot about this, and I'm going to skip over this. You already know about Give Well and Giving What We Can and The Life You Can Save, 3 sources of trying to look at effectiveness. I do think it's a really important issue, and I will just say one little thing that is relevant here. We do have to be careful, I think, in terms of acknowledging the lack of certainty about some of the things that we're arguing about. One of the examples that has been used often by effective altruists and is used, for example, by Will McCaskill in Doing Good Better, and I've used it as well, and it's on the best charities list of these organisations, and one of this little slice of highly recommended top charities by GiveWell, is getting rid of parasitical worms, deworming children in developing countries. And it's the organisations that do this, supported by GiveWell and others, are SCI, Schistosomiasis Control Initiative, and Deworm the World. There have been, just in the last month or so, there have been a couple of papers published criticising one of the key studies that describe the benefits of deworming, particularly criticising the extent to which deworming improves school attendance and school achievement. And the initial response from GiveWell has been to say, well, this is interesting and it's good that people are doing this sort of reassessment, but it doesn't really lead us to change our assessment. And Giving What We Can has said the same. So far, The Life You Can Save, which is the one that I'm more closely involved with, has also not yet changed its recommendation, but we're certainly thinking about this. It does show that the issues can get quite complicated. When you have different researchers who are specialists in a field like what are the effects of deworming kids in Africa, disagreeing about whether those effects are sufficient to justify programs of mass deworming of kids, then it shows why things are difficult for ordinary lay people to really get a hold of. And my personal view, for what it's worth, is that even though it may be true, as GiveWell and Giving What We Can have been saying, that these critiques of the original studies are not sufficient to show that these are not very good charities. If we have other charities that are not under critique in the same way, like the Against Malaria Foundation, then my inclination is to say that's where we ought to be putting our donations at this stage. Maybe the dust will settle and we'll see that, or people will do further good studies to show that the critiques of deworming were not justified, but at least we need to be open-minded. And we can get committed to what we've already said. We don't like to backtrack. So I think we ought to acknowledge that we're human and we're not necessarily completely impartial and open-minded when somebody comes up with a critique of a charity that we have previously recommended people should be donating to. Okay, I have 2 minutes left. I wanted to say a very brief word about motivation. Often people ask you, well, okay, there are these people who are effective altruists. I'm not quite sure why they're doing it. What are you going to say to me about why I should do this? So I do think it's important to say something about this. I've already referred to Julia Wise's Giving Gladly blog and her view about it. I think there are a few things you can say that are interesting. This is a book that I rather like by a Canadian philosopher called Richard Keshen, called Reasonable Self-Esteem, who talks about the importance of self-esteem, and psychologists agree that having high self-esteem is a really important component of feeling that your life is going well, of being satisfied with your life. And that's to do with having your values in harmony with what you're doing. Not perfect harmony, so none of us are saints, but in a reasonable degree of harmony. And Keshen's point is that if you are reasonable, I mean, maybe not everybody will see this, but if you are open to reasoning and thinking about the world, it's hard to have self-esteem while ignoring the interests of others whose well-being you recognise as equally significant. That goes back to Sedgwick's point about being able to take the point of view of the universe. And if that's so, then being an effective altruist is likely to increase your self-esteem for reasonable people and improve your well-being. And I'm going to close with a friend of mine, now unfortunately no longer alive, but who was a great pioneer of the animal movement in the late 20th century, Henry Spira. And I did an interview with Henry when he knew that he was dying. He knew that he had terminal cancer and he was close to the end of his life. And I wrote a book about him called Ethics into Action, which is about strategies and tactics in the animal movement, because I felt that the kinds of things that Henry had done ought to be known and not lost so that other people could follow them. But I also wanted to talk, because he was so calm and in a way content in the face of death, I wanted him to talk about that and his attitude to life. And so he said a few things, but I think this is the quote that stuck with me and that I use. He says, I guess basically one wants to feel that one's life has amounted to more than just consuming products and generating garbage. One likes to look back and think that one's done the best one can to make this a better place for others. It's not a sense of duty, but rather this is what I want to do. I feel best when I'm doing it well. And I knew Henry from the 1970s until he died in 1998. And I think he really did enjoy life. He always had zest and energy for what he was doing because he did feel he was making a difference, and he certainly was doing it well. So I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.